I'm Richard Appelbaum. I am director of the Master's Program in Global and International Studies here at UC Santa Barbara. So my initial expertise had to do with housing, urban issues, poverty, global issues generally. All of my classmates were studying businesses and how they set up, but I was interested in the time at how the Indians, the indigenous people, the Mam language speaking people, survived. And I spent a couple of months in the village of San Ildefonso Ixtuacan, not far from the border of Chiapas, Mexico, interviewing Indians in the mountains where they worked in their cornfields, asking them about their experience. And I learned how horrible their lives were, how Indians migrated to the coastal plantations every year. They died en route in overheated trucks, and that really fueled my interest internationally. It was truly my first real exposure to third world living conditions. I spent 18 months actually in Peru, where I worked on one project that went out to small villages in the Andean highlands, talking to people about their problems. And I also did some work on a development plan for the city of Lima, where I focused on the barriadas, the shantytown housing. And so I came back with a passion for understanding global issues and what can be done to improve the lives of people who lived in these circumstances. I spent probably 15 or 20 years studying domestic problems in the U.S. I was especially interested in homelessness and housing. And during the course of that time, I wrote a number of books on urban poverty in the U.S. But in the course of focusing on urban problems, I became convinced that the problems that were plaguing the United States, growing poverty, growing inequality, could be tied to globalization. A lot of these problems began in the early 70s, which was just around the time that the microchip became commercially available, that container ships began to carry goods from Asia to the United States. And so I became interested then in globalization and understanding how the U.S. economy was interlinked with the economies of other countries, especially the countries of Asia. So I began doing research on two different topics. One topic was, how did countries like South Korea or Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore or China, how did they rise up and become economically powerful when a generation ago they were impoverished places that had only sweatshops? They were producing a middle class. And I became convinced that it was because the governments of those countries had played a leading role in directing their economic development. They were, to use the language, developmental states. This interested me because at the time, during the Reagan years and the Thatcher years in England, the role of government had been devalued and the U.S. government was pulling back. And I saw a part of the world where the government was proactive and it seemed to be paying dividends. But I also saw the dark side of globalization, sweatshops that were emerging. And so in addition to studying the role of state policy in driving development, I became interested also in the working and living conditions of the people who are making goods for us in the United States. So a big part of my research also focused on factories, especially in China, working conditions in those factories. I returned to the United States and studied the garment industry in Los Angeles. I wrote a book with a colleague, Edna Bonasic, called Behind the Label, which looked at the less glamorous side of the fashion industry, the roughly 120,000 largely undocumented immigrant workers in Los Angeles who drove the garment industry there. In both cases, I was interested in what could be done. What could be the role of government policy to solve these kinds of problems? Then, more recently, I've also become interested in the role of technology in driving economic development. So I'm part of a center which is funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation called the Center for Nanotechnology and Society, which is looking at emerging technologies, nanotechnology, biotech, and so forth, and their role in globalization. And my part of this has been to go back to China to study not only sweatshop factories that are making running shoes and clothing and things like that, but also the high-tech move that China is now making to confront the U.S. and other countries as a technology leader, to move away from being dependent on low-wage production and to become a player at the sort of top levels of the world economy. And that also has implications for policy. What is China doing? What should the U.S. be doing? And importantly, how can we work together? Big part of my research looks at the role of international collaboration among scientists and engineers to solve problems in healthcare, clean water delivery, water purification, cheap energy, to focus on these questions. Always having in mind not what is the academic understanding by itself, but what policies can emerge from this. How can poor countries make a technological leap forward? It's possible today. It's possible now for technologies to be shared globally because of the internet and the circulation of scientists and engineers. The world is in a major transition, as significant as the agricultural or industrial revolution, a sort of tectonic shifting of the plates. A world dominated by nation states, in which countries have been the key actors in the world. And economies, while they've always been somewhat globalized, have more been contained within national borders. We are now moving into a world where countries are less effective as actors. And many global processes don't respect national borders. I focus on economic issues, but transnational corporations, the flow of cash at the click of a mouse, all the things which have made the world, the financial meltdown, which shows that what happens in the U.S. affects stock markets and credit availability the world over. But the same is true of religion, true of culture, pop culture, rock and roll. It's true of the environment. We all occupy the same planet and so forth. So we have this interesting moment in history where the systems of governance that exist to regulate the world are still bound largely within nation states. But the forces of greatest consequence and impact on our lives that are changing everything are not tied to nation states. There is a mismatch. And it is into that space that civil society organizations have emerged as increasingly important and have grown in 20 years from a few thousand registered organizations to 20, 30,000, probably hundreds of thousands, many of which don't appear on any ledger or any recording. So it is non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that play an increasing role to fill in the spaces where government won't move or can't move and that businesses are indifferent to. And these basically have to do with delivery of social services, issues of social justice, of poverty, of health, of sustainable economic development, human rights.